Volume 2, Chapter 14 of The Widow Barnaby by Francis Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. A Cheltenham Ball, an Introduction, a Conquest. A great deal of profound meditation was bestowed by Mrs. Barnaby on the occurrences of that morning before the time arrived for the toilette, preparatory to the ball of the succeeding night. All these will show themselves in their results as they arise. And for the present it will be only necessary to mention that in providing for this toilette, everything approaching to the sordid cares dictated by economy was banished. The time was too short to admit of her ordering a new dress for this occasion, though the powerful feeling at work within her caused a white satin, decorated in every possible way with the richest blonde, to be bespoken for the next. Every other article that Cheltenham could furnish, and it being the height of the season, Paris itself could hardly do more for her. Every other species of expensive decoration, short of diamonds and pearls, was purchased for this important ball, at which something within her, speaking with the authority of an oracle, declared that she should become acquainted with Lord Mucklebury. Busy as were the afternoon and morning which intervened, she found time for the very necessary business of ordering her broker — he had been her father's broker — to sell out £500 stock for her, and this done, and her letter safely deposited in the boarding-house letter-bag, she turned her thoughts towards Agnes. She had certainly, to use her own language when reasoning the point with herself, the very greatest mind in the world not to take her to the ball at all. But this mind, great as it was not a settled mind, and was presently shaken by a sort of instinctive consciousness that there was in Agnes, independent of her beauty, a something that might help to give consequence to her entrée. As to her dress, thought she, I am perfectly determined that it shall be the same she wore at Clifton. Not so much on account of the expense — at the present moment it would be madness to permit such a consideration to have any effect — but because it gives her an air more distinguished, more remarkable than any one else. And besides, who knows but that the contrast of style, beautiful as she is, may be favourable to me? I have not forgotten our fellow traveller from Silverton, she seemed to freeze him. And let her freeze my adorable Viscount too, so that But here her thoughts came too rapidly to dress themselves in words, and for a few minutes her reverie was rather a tumult than a meditation. " Yes, she shall go," she exclaimed at last, rising from the sofa, and collecting a variety of precious parcels, the result of her shopping. " Yes, she shall go to the ball, and should any mischief be likely to follow, I will make her go out to service before the end of the week." Having thus at last come to a determination, and upon reasonings which she felt were not likely to be shaken, she mounted to her sleeping apartment, and after indulging herself by spreading forth various articles of newly purchased finery upon the bed, she turned to the corner in which Agnes, her tiny table, her books, and writing apparatus were all packed away together in the smallest possible space, and said, " Come here, Agnes, you must have done lessons enough for to day, and I have great news for you. Where do you think I mean to take you to night?" Agnes cast her eyes upon the bed, and immediately anticipating some public display of which she was doomed to be a witness, replied in a tone that was anything but joyful, " I don't know, aunt." " I don't know, aunt !" retorted Mrs. Barnaby, indignantly mimicking her tone. " What an owl of a girl you are, Agnes ! Oh, how unlike what I was at the same age, you don't know. I suppose you don't, indeed. There is not another woman under the sun besides myself who would do for a dependent, penniless girl all I am doing for you. I sacrifice everything for you — my feelings, my health, my money, and yet you look exactly as if I was going to take you to school again instead of a ball." Agnes sighed. She thought of her last ball, of all its pains and all its pleasures ; and feeling but too sure that it was as impossible she should escape the former, as improbable that she should find the latter, she replied mournfully enough, " I would rather not go, if you please, aunt. I do not like balls." " Upon my honour, Agnes, if I had not a temper that was proof against everything, I should be tempted to box your ears. Is it possible to see anything more disgustingly hypocritical than a girl of 17 screwing herself up and saying, ' I do not like balls '? I wonder what you do like, Miss Prim ? But I promise you, I do not intend to ask your leave for what I do, and as long as you eat my bread you will do as I bid you, or else turn out and provide for yourself at once. Let me hear no more such stuff, if you please. But take care to make yourself decent, and be ready to get into the carriage exactly at 9 o'clock. Do you hear?" Agnes meekly turned to her travelling magazine of sable suits, and was considerably surprised by being told that she must instantly get ready to go out for the purpose of buying satin shoes, white gloves, and one or two other trifles which the newly enlarged views of her aunt now rendered necessary. All this was done. Miss Morrison engaged to join their party, the labours of the hairdresser were completed, and a toilette of 2 hours' duration was brought to a most satisfactory conclusion within 10 minutes of the early hour she had named, and to the ball room they repaired considerably before any other person entered it. " I told you it would be so, my dear Mrs. Barnaby," said Miss Morrison, looking rather disconsolately round her. " Nous sommes trop tôt. But never mind, let us sit down comfortably on this sofa, and I dare say I shall be able to tell you the names of most of the principal people. Cheltenham is so very delightful, that almost everybody comes over and over again. C'est tout a fait la mode." A few straggling strangers began to enter almost immediately, and in about half an hour the well pleased Miss Morrison was enabled to redeem her promise by pointing out some scores of well dressed individuals by name. But still Lord Mucklebury came not, and the widow's heart grew sad, till happily she heard a young partnerless lady say as she swept by, " What a bore it is that all the best men come so late." In a moment hope was rekindled in Mrs. Barnaby's eye, and with renewed interest she listened to the catalogue of names which her friend poured into her ear. " Oh, here comes the bride, Lady Stephenson. What a handsome man her husband is! I have seen her here often with her aunt Lady Elizabeth Norris, before she was married. The old lady dotes upon Cheltenham, they say. I wish you knew some more people ; but, name port, it will all come by and by, I dare say, and I will introduce you to Lady Elizabeth if I can. But I must ask her first, or she may take miff. Elle hay ung piu fear." " Stephenson ?" said Mrs. Barnaby. " Is it Sir Edward Stephenson ?"" Yes, Sir Edward, that's his name. Do you know him, Mrs. Barnaby? We were most intimately acquainted with his brother at Clifton, and with Colonel Hubert too. That's her brother, you know. Pray, is he here too?" How Agnes trembled as she waited for the answer. " I don't know. I have not seen him yet," replied Miss Morrison, " and it is impossible to overlook him. C'est un homme superbe. But comme il est fier. Perhaps he will come in presently. He is always un peu tard at the balls, for he never dances." " Oh, I know that," said Mrs. Barnaby. " I know him perfectly well, I assure you. He is a most elegant person ; but I suspect he is rather of a violent and jealous temper. However, I'm sure I wish he was here, and his friend Frederick Stephenson too. He's a charming young man, and used to walk to Bristol with us, and dance 3 times a night with Agnes." " Dear me, you don't say so !" exclaimed Miss Morrison, to whom the intelligence was extremely agreeable, as it removed at once all doubts and fears respecting Mrs. Barnaby's real station in society. " Well, then, I'm sure you ought to know Lady Elizabeth Norris ; and I really must somehow or other contrive to let her hear of your acquaintance with her nephew, Colonel Hubert. They say she dotes upon him, and that he is to be her heir, and that's almost a pity, for he has a noble fortune of his own already. Do you happen to know how much his sister had, Mrs. Barnaby? Some say 20, some 30, some 50,000. " Young Stephenson never happened to say anything about it that I recollect," replied the widow. " But look ! Lady Elizabeth is coming this way. You had better step forward, Miss Morrison, that she may see you." But there was no occasion for any contrivance on the part of Miss Morrison in order to obtain the notice of Lady Elizabeth ; for that lady having descried and recognised the party, she immediately decided that Miss Morrison, whose acquaintance she had cultivated for several successive seasons, on account of her admirable French, should be for her the medium of introduction to the pompous widow, who was clever enough to make her niece drink the waters instead of herself. It was therefore by a straight and direct line that, supported by the arm of Sir Edward Stephenson, and followed by his lady, she crossed the room from her own place to that occupied by those whom, in her own particular manner, she delighted to honour. Miss Morrison's surprise was as great as her satisfaction when she perceived this to be the case ; and she felt her triumph doubled by her fine new acquaintance being the witness of it. " Bonjour, Miss Morrison," said the old lady, holding out her hand. " Toujours en bonne sante, j'espere?" Amidst smiles and bows, and blushes and courtesies, Miss Morrison replied in her favourite jargon, " Mais oui, milady. and I hope your ladyship is the same." "A good many old faces here, Miss Morrison, and a good many new ones, too. You have friends with whom I do not remember to have seen before. You must introduce me." This request threw the good-natured spinster into a twitter of delight which almost deprived her of the power of obeying it. First she made a little movement with one hand, and then with the other; while the ample Mrs. Barnaby stood in happy smiling expectation, and the tall, stiff-looking old lady continued gazing at the group through her half-closed eyes, and determined on no account to hasten a process from which she derived so great amusement. At length the respective names were pronounced in their proper order, that of the blushing Agnes being included. The old lady gave her a look in which something of surprise was mingled with curiosity, and suddenly turning round to Lady Stephenson, who stood behind her, she said, " Come, Emily, you must be introduced too. Miss Willoughby, Lady Stephenson." Mrs. Barnaby had prepared another smile and another majestic bend for the presentation of herself to the fair bride, but it did not follow; a disappointment for which she was soon consoled by Lady Elizabeth's sitting down, and graciously intimating by an action of her hand that the widow might sit beside her. Agnes meanwhile stood trembling from head to foot, with her eyes timidly fixed on the beautiful countenance of Colonel Hubert's sister. As it was quite impossible her ladyship could understand the cause of the agitation she inspired, so neither was she at all aware of its strength. But she saw that the beautiful girl before her, notwithstanding the quiet, unstudied grace of her appearance, was not at her ease, and could only account for it by supposing that she was suffering from extreme shyness. Lady Stephenson had not yet forgotten the time when she, too, had hardly dared to look up unless her paternal brother, as she was wont to call him, stood very near to sustain her carriage, and, sympathizing with a weakness that was in some degree constitutional in herself, she felt disposed to take more notice of the fair stranger than she usually bestowed upon persons introduced to her by the whimsical caprices of her aunt. Lady Stephenson was, however, altogether mistaken. Agnes was not at that moment suffering from shyness. There was timidity, certainly, in the pleasure with which she listened to the voice and gazed at the features of Colonel Hubert's sister; but still it was pleasure, and very nearly the most lively she had ever experienced. " You are at Cheltenham for the first time, Miss Willoughby? " said the bride. " Yes," replied Agnes ;" we only arrived 2 days ago." There was not much opportunity of indicating a feeling of any kind by these words ; nevertheless, the manner with which they were spoken, and the sweet expression of the beautiful eyes that were raised to hers, convinced Lady Stephenson that however shy her new acquaintance might be, she greatly liked to be spoken to, and accordingly continued the conversation, which, to her own surprise, warmed so much as it proceeded, that at length her aunt being evidently settled down for an elaborate development of the absurdities, whatever they might be, of her new acquaintance, she offered her arm, inviting her to take a turn round the room. Could this be real? Was it possible that she was walking round the Cheltenham ballroom on the arm of Colonel Hubert's sister? But though the happy Agnes asked herself this question again and again, neither the asking nor the answering it prevented her bearing her part in a conversation that made her so exquisitely happy with all the pretty earnestness of one interested in every word that was said to her, and too young and fresh minded to conceal the pleasure she felt. Lady Stephenson was unexpectedly pleased with her young companion. There was no mixture of niaiserie in the simplicity of Agnes ; and though her ladyship in no degree shared her aunt's extravagant passion for originals, she had in her own quiet way a reasonably strong liking for whatever appeared to her untainted by affectation. The beauty of Agnes might perhaps have had some share in the pleasure she gave ; but certain it is that, after taking 2 or 3 turns together instead of one, and perceiving Lady Elizabeth about to move her quarters in search of fresh amusement, she shook hands with Agnes before parting with her so cordially, that she felt called upon to offer some reason for it to her husband, who had quitted her during her promenade, but was now returned. " That is by far the most enchanting girl, Edward, in person, mind, and manners, that I ever remember to have met with. How very strange that she should belong to one of my aunt's collection." " She is vastly beautiful, Emily," replied Sir Edward, " and I suspect that covers a multitude of sins in your eyes, for I observe you never fail to pick out the beauties, go where you will. I declare I think your eyes are infinitely sharper than mine in this way. Having once found out the fairest of the fair, I do not feel so much interest as I used to do in looking about me." " A very pretty speech, Sir Edward," returned the lady, laughing. But that sweet girl's beauty is not her greatest fascination. I must ask Lady Elizabeth whether she found the magnificent lady to whom she has been devoting herself answer her expectations." When this question was put to the old lady, however, she bluntly answered, " No, not at all. She is as dull as a prize ox decorated with ribbons at a fair." " I am sorry to hear it," observed Lady Stephenson, " for I have lost my heart to the fair girl in black whom she seems to lead about as a contrast to her radiant self. I marvel what the connection can be. It is plain they are not related, from the deep mourning of the one and the rainbow brilliance of the other." " Your inference is altogether wrong, my Lady Stephenson. One of this Madame Barnaby's long stories was about this melancholy miss, who is her niece, and who will wear mourning in spite of her. I must watch them at the pump, just to see if the girl makes up for her disobedience in this respect by swallowing the waters, which Pringle says the aunt is determined she shall take, and after that I shall trouble myself no more about them. The great woman does not answer, she is a vulgar, pompous, everyday bore." " Pray do not give her quite up, aunt, for my sake," said Lady Stephenson, " for I have set my fancy upon seeing a great deal more of her niece, who, by the way, for so pertinacious a mourner, is wonderfully sprightly. But I must flatter myself she found consolation in my society. I must beg you to cultivate the acquaintance a little farther." " This is something quite new, Emily," replied the old lady. " It is the first time, I believe, that you ever condescended to take any interest in my menagerie. Far be it from me, my dear, to check so happy a symptom of an improving intellect. I have already asked the expansive widow and her delicate shadow for Wednesday ; and if your fever for cementing a friendship with the latter should happen to continue, yield to it by all means. You know, Emily, I never wish to control anybody's set of favourites, provided always that nobody interferes with my own." The only pleasure which the rest of the evening afforded Agnes arose from studying the features, and still more the countenance of Lady Stephenson, whenever she was fortunate enough to be within sight of her. No one asked her to dance, and no word was uttered within her hearing that gave her the least amusement. One single circumstance cheered the tedious hours during which she was doomed to sit with her aunt Barnaby before her eyes, in a terror which increased every moment lest she should draw the eyes of every one else in the room upon her. This single circumstance was, that the sister of Colonel Hubert, when standing at the 3 feet of distance from her, turned her head and said, with a smile of strong family affinity to his own, " I find that I am to have the pleasure of seeing you on Wednesday at my aunt's, Miss Willoughby. I am very glad of it. Good night." And soon afterwards the party left the room. Far different was the fate of Mrs. Barnaby. The evening began for her very gloriously, for she had been spoken to by a Lady Elizabeth, but it ended in rapture, for before its close Lord Mucklebury made his appearance, stared at her again with the most marked impertinence, inquired and learned her name from Mr. Pringle, by whom he was at his express desire presented, and finally he placed himself beside her on the sofa, where he remained for at least 20 minutes, talking to her in a style that might be said without the slightest exaggeration to have thrown her into a state of temporary delirium. Nor had it failed to produce some emotion in the noble lord. Nay, it is probable it might have lasted longer had it amused him less ; for when he took his leave of the widow, expressing his hope that he should be happy enough to meet her again, he moved with a step rather quicker than ordinary to ensconce himself among a knot of men who were amusing themselves by communicating to each other the most ludicrous remarks on the company in a distant corner of the room. " Have you really torn yourself away from that magnificent specimen of womanhood, Mucklebury ?" said one of the group as he approached them. " She is evidently magnetic by the manner in which you have been revolving round her for some time ; and if magnetic, and the power at all proportioned to the volume, it is a miracle that you ever left her side again." " I never would leave her side again," replied Lord Mucklebury, laughing immoderately, " did I not fear that I should fall at her feet in a fit. Oh, she is glorious." " Who and what is she, in God's name ?" said another. " Who is she ? Barnaby, bless her ! Mistress Barnaby. What is she ? A widow, darling creature, a widow, fair, fat, and 40, most fat, most fair, and oh ! a pigeon, a dove, a very turtle dove for kindness." " She is really handsome, though, isn't she, Mucklebury ?" said one. " Yes, upon my soul she is," replied the viscount more seriously. and bears looking at too remarkably well, notwithstanding the pot full of coarse rouge that it pleases her to carry about on each of her beautiful cheeks. And by what blessed chance has your lordship been favoured with an introduction? Or did your lordship so far overcome your constitutional timidity as to introduce yourself?" "Alarm not your spirit on that score, Digby," replied Lord Mucklebury. "The medium of introduction was illustrious, but my passion was anterior to it, for the history of our loves was in this wise. It is said of me, I know not how truly, that my taste in beauty tends somewhat towards the Blazabella order. But this as it may, it is certain that yesterday morning, between the hours of 2 and 3, being actively employed for the good of myself and my country in Johnson's sale room, I felt myself penetrated, perforated, pierced, and transfixed by the very bright eyes of this remarkable lady. Whereupon, overpowering my constitutional timidity, Digby, I fixed my regards, eyeglass and all, upon her. But the result was astonishing. Did any of you, gentlemen, ever happen to watch the effect of the sun's rays when thrown upon some soft substance, a pound of butter, for example, through the medium of a burning glass? Such and so great was that produced by the rays of my right eye when sent through my eyeglass upon this charming creature. She warmed, trembled, yea, visibly melted under it. I inquired her name on the spot, but in vain. This evening I have been more successful, and now I have the inexpressible felicity of being enrolled as an acquaintance of this inimitable widow." "A very interesting narrative," said one of his auditors, "and may I ask your lordship what it can be that has now induced you to leave her fair side all unguarded?" "Ecstasy, Tom. I had not strength to witness the emotions I inspired. I tell you, I must have fallen at her feet had I continued near her." The conversation of these merry gentlemen went on for some time longer in the same strain, forming a contrast, perhaps not very uncommon, to the solemn and serious meditations of Mrs. Barnaby on the very same circumstances which caused their mirth. Far, however, from exaggerating the effect he had produced, Lord Mucklebury had little or no idea of its strength and reality. He fancied the lady inflammable, and easily touched by any appearance of admiration; but it never entered his head to suppose that his flourishing speeches and audacious eyes had given birth in her mind to the most sanguine hope, and the most deliberate intention, of becoming Viscountess Mucklebury. Sudden as the formation of these hopes and intentions may appear, it would be doing injustice to Mrs. Barnaby were the reader suffered to believe that they were permitted to take possession of her heedlessly. She remembered Major Allen, she remembered the agony of the moment in which she beheld his friend Maintry appear in the character of a thief; and, sweet to her ears as was the title of her new conquest, she did not suffer to charm away her resolution of discovering whether he were poor or rich. Every inquiry tended to prove that she was safe in the direction which her ambition and her love had now taken. Lord Mucklebury was a widower, with an only son very nobly provided for, and as capable of making a good jointure if he married again as a widow's heart could wish. Now then all that remained to be done was to foster the admiration she had inspired into a passion strong enough to induce the noble Viscount to settle that jointure upon her. Nothing could be more just than her reasoning, nothing more resolute than her purpose. She knew she was handsome, she felt it to be advisable that she should appear rich, and with the devoted feeling of a warrior who throws away his scabbard as he rushes to the onslaught, Mrs. Barnaby heroically set herself to win her way to victory, coûte qui coûte. End of chapter 14. Volume 2, Chapter 15 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. New hopes beget a new style of existence. A party. Agnes has some success, which Mrs. Barnaby does not quite approve. Lord Mucklebury enters into an epistolary correspondence with the widow, by which her hopes are raised to the highest pitch. But Lord Mucklebury leaves Cheltenham. Lord Mucklebury was a gay man in every sense of the word. He loved a jest almost as well as a dinner, and would rather have been quoted as the sayer of a good thing than as the doer of a great one. He had enjoyed life with fewer drawbacks from misfortune than most men; and having reached the age of 40, had made up his mind, as soberly as he could do on any subject, that the only privilege of the aristocracy worth valuing was the leisure they enjoyed, or might enjoy if they chose it, for amusing themselves. Nature intended him for a good-tempered man, but fun had spoiled him. Having laughed with everybody for the first 20 years of his life, he learned during the second that it was a better joke still to laugh at them; and accordingly the principal material for the wit on which his reputation rested was derived, at the time Mrs. Barnaby made his acquaintance, from an aptitude to perceive the absurdities of his fellow creatures, and a most unshrinking audacity in exposing them. Having pointed out Mrs. Barnaby to a set of his clever friends as the joke in which he meant to indulge during the 3 or 4 weeks of Cheltenham discipline to which he annually submitted, it became necessary to his honour that he should prove her to be ridiculous enough to merit the distinction. And he knew well enough that all she required to make her perfect in this line was as much nonsense from himself as would keep her vanity afloat. The occupation suited him exactly. It threatened little fatigue, and promised much amusement. So that by the time Mrs. Barnaby had made up her mind to win and wear his lordship's coronet, he had decided with equal sincerity of purpose to render her the jest of the season to his Cheltenham acquaintance. An hour's close examination of Miss Morrison concerning the manière d'être of the beau monde during the season sufficed to convince the widow that, expensive as the boarding house had appeared to her, it was far from being all that was necessary for her present purpose. She must have a carriage, she must have a tall footman, she must have a smart lady's maid; and great was the credit due to the zeal and activity of this invaluable friend for the promptitude and despatch with which these indispensable articles were supplied. Some idea of this may be gathered from the fact that the carriage which conveyed them to the house of Lady Elizabeth Norris was one hired, horses, coachman, and all, for the season; while the first applicant of 6 feet high who appeared, in consequence of the earnest requisition for such an individual made at half a dozen different shops, followed the widow in a full suit of livery the following Sunday to church. Agnes looked on at first with wonder, which a little reflection converted into great misery. She knew absolutely nothing as to the amount of her aunt's fortune, but there was a wild heedlessness of expense in her present manner of proceeding that, despite her ignorance, made her tremble for the result. The idea that she might, by persevering industry, render herself fit to become a governess, was that which most tended to console her. But Agnes's estimate of what was required for this was a very high one, and greatly did she rejoice to find that her aunt permitted her to be wholly mistress of her time, seldom inviting her to go out, and receiving her apologies for declining to do so with a degree of complacency which plainly enough showed they were not unwelcome. Lady Elizabeth Norris's party was 5 days after the ball, and before it arrived Mrs. Barnaby had persuaded herself into the firmest possible conviction of Lord Mucklebury's devoted attachment and honourable intentions. Had his lordship not been one of the invited guests, Mrs. Barnaby would unquestionably have given up the engagement, though but a few short days before it had appeared to her very like a permission to enter the gates of paradise. But her estimate of all things was changed. She was already a viscountess in all her reasonings, and perhaps the only person who held an unchanged value was the poor Agnes, whose helpless dependence could not place her in a position of less consideration than it had done before. " Pray, Miss Agnes, is it your pleasure to go to Lady Elizabeth Norris's this evening?" said Mrs. Barnaby, while watching her new maid's assiduous preparations for her own toilette. " Oh yes, aunt, if you have no objection. I should like to go very much indeed." " Nay, child, you may go if you wish it. I imagine it will prove but a humdrum sort of thing. Wear the same dress that you did at the ball. My maid shall arrange your hair for you." Yet, notwithstanding all this increase of dignity, Agnes never for a moment guessed what was going on. She had never seen Lord Mucklebury excepting at the ball, and her imagination had not suggested to her the possibility that so casual an acquaintance could be the cause of all she saw and heard. Had Agnes been as light-hearted as when she used to sit upon her travelling trunk in her closet at Clifton, listening to the lively gossip of her friend Mary, the party at Lady Elizabeth's would have been pregnant with amusement. But as it was, she sat very sadly alone in a corner; for during the first portion of the evening Sir Edward Stephenson and his lady were not present, having dined out, where they were detained much beyond the hour at which the majority of Lady Elizabeth's guests assembled. But the lively old woman wanted no one to assist her in the task of entertaining her company, for in truth she was not particularly anxious about their entertainment. her sole object in bringing them all together being to amuse herself, and this she achieved in a way less agreeable, perhaps, to one who, like Agnes, was a mere passive spectator, than to those who were expected to take a more active part. During the early part of the evening, few persons appeared excepting such as she had expressly desired to come early, and there was not one of these undistinguished by some peculiarity from which the whimsical old lady derived amusement. It was her custom to place herself immovably in a huge arm chair, with a small table before her, on which was placed her tea, coffee, ice, biscuits, or anything else she might choose, with quite as little ceremony as if she had been alone. A book or two also, with a pair of wax lights having a green shade over them, never failed to make part of the preparation for her evening's amusement, and to these she never scrupled to address herself if her people proved less entertaining than she expected. Every one as they entered approached this throne to pay their compliments, and then seated themselves at some distance, one single chair alone being permitted to stand near her. To this place all those whom she wished to listen to were called in succession, and dismissed when she had had enough of them, with the same absence of all ordinary civility as she was sure to display to all those who were so ill advised as to appear at her unceremonious bidding. Both her nephew and niece had often remonstrated with her on the subject of these strange reunions, but she defended herself from the charge of behaving rudely to those who, in accepting her invitations, had a right to expect civility, by saying, I am as civil as they deserve. My title is the Duke and Me, that calls fools into my circle, and till I cease to be Lady Elizabeth they get what they come for. For the most part, the company were rather odd looking than elegant, and the newly awakened grandeur of Mrs. Barnaby was a little wounded by observing how few persons there were present whose dress entitled them to the honour of meeting her and her dress. Lady Elizabeth, moreover, received her very coldly, though to Agnes she said, How do you do, my dear? Lady Stephenson will be here presently. What vulgar ignorance! thought the widow, as she retreated to a sofa commanding a perfect view of the door by which the company entered. Notwithstanding her title, that woman must have been wretchedly brought up. Should I, in my second marriage, be blessed with offspring, I shall make it my first object to teach them manners befitting their rank. The absurdities of Lady Elizabeth's guests on this evening were not sufficiently piquant to justify a detailed description. One old gentleman was summoned to the chair, that he might recount how many habitual drunkards, both male and female, he had converted into happy water drinkers by the simple process of making them take an oath. Another amused her ladyship for several minutes by what she called saying his peerage, that is, by repeating a catalogue of noble names, all of which he stated to belong to his most familiar friends. One lady was had up for the purpose of repeating her own poetry, and another that she might, by a little prompting, give vent to some favourite metaphysical doctrine, which it was her forte to envelope in words of her own construction. Miss Morrison, too, was courted into talking of Paris in her own French, but altogether the meeting was not successful, and Lady Elizabeth was in the act of arranging the shade of her lights, so as to permit her reading at her ease, when her eye, as she looked round the room, chanced to fall upon Agnes. She was on the point of calling to her by name, but there was a modest tranquillity in her delicate face that the imperious old lady felt no inclination to startle, and, instead of speaking to her, she addressed her aunt. " Pray, Mrs. Barnaby, does your young lady play or sing? We are mighty drowsy, I think, to night, all of us, and if she does, I should be really much obliged if she will favour us. Lady Stephenson's instrument is a very fine one." Mrs. Barnaby was so little pleased by her reception, and so completely out of sorts at the non-arrival of Lord Mucklebury, that she answered as little graciously as it was well possible, " I don't think there is any chance of her amusing your ladyship." Great was the widow's surprise when she saw the quiet unpresuming Agnes rise from her distant chair, walk fearlessly across the circle to that of Lady Elizabeth, and heard her say in a low voice, but quite distinctly, " I do sing and play a little, Lady Elizabeth, and if it be your ladyship's wish that I should make the attempt now, I shall be happy to obey you." Perhaps Lady Elizabeth was as much surprised as Mrs. Barnaby, but though she understood not the feeling that had prompted this wish to oblige her, she was pleased by it, and rising for the first time that evening from her chair, she took Agnes by the arm, and led her to the piano forte. " Does your ladyship love music? " said Agnes, trembling at her own temerity, but longing irresistibly to be noticed by the aunt of Colonel Hubert. " Yes, my dear, I do indeed," replied the old lady. " It is one of our family failings. I believe we all love it too well." "Which does your ladyship prefer, old songs or new ones?" said Agnes. "Old ones, most decidedly," she replied; "but at your age, my dear, and in the present state of musical science, it is hardly likely you should be able to indulge my old-fashioned whim in this respect." "My practice has been chiefly from the old masters," replied Agnes, turning over the leaves of a volume of Handel. "Say you so, my little girl? Then I will sit by you as you play." The delighted Agnes, wondering at her own audacious courage, assiduously placed a chair for the old lady, and with a flutter at her heart that seemed almost like happiness, turned to the song that she had seen produce on Colonel Hubert an effect never to be forgotten. It had brought tears to the eyes of the gallant soldier, and given to his features such dangerous softness, that the poor minstrel had never recovered the effects of it. To sing it again to the ear of his aunt was like coming back towards him, and the alleviation this brought to the terrible fear of having lost sight of him for ever, not only gave her the courage necessary to bring her to the place she now occupied, but inspired her with animation, skill, and power to sing with a perfection she had never reached before. The pleased attention of Lady Elizabeth had been given in the first instance to reward the ready effort made to comply with her wishes ; but long before the song was ended she had forgotten how she had obtained it, had forgotten everything save her own deep delight and admiration of the beautiful siren who had caused it. Silent and motionless she waited till the last chord of the concluding symphony had died away, and then, rising from her chair, she bent down over Agnes, and having gazed earnestly in her face for a moment, kissed her fair forehead once, twice, and again with a cordiality that thanked her better than any words could have done. Agnes was greatly touched, greatly gratified, and forgetting the inexpediency of giving way to feelings that it was neither possible nor desirable should be understood, she seized the good lady's hand, pressed it to her bosom, and looking up to her with eyes swimming in tears of joy, said in a voice of deep feeling, " I am so very glad you like me." " Why, what a precious little creature you are !" exclaimed Lady Elizabeth, half aroused and half softened. " As original to the full as any of my queer company here, and quite as remarkable for sweetness and talent as they for the want of them. Where did you grow, fair lily flower? And how came you to be transplanted hither by so But never mind all this now. If we get on well together we shall get better acquainted. What shall I call you, pretty one ?"" Agnes, if you please, Lady Elizabeth. Agnes Willoughby," replied the happy girl, becoming every moment more delighted at the result of the bold measure she had taken. " You must come to me to morrow morning, Agnes, while I am at breakfast, at 10 o'clock, remember, for then I am alone ; and you must come prepared, my child, to talk to me about yourself, for I can't understand it at all, and I never choose to be puzzled longer than I can help it upon any subject. But listen to my monsters, if they are not presuming to be noisy behind my back. Then lull me, charming air, my senses wrap in wonder sweet, like snow on wool thy footsteps are, soft as a spirit's are thy feet," exclaimed the old lady in a whisper close to the ear of Agnes. " Sing to me again, my child, and I will send a message to them in words borrowed from the famous epitaph on Juan Cabeca, ' Hold your tongues, ye calves !' And turning herself round, she beckoned to a servant who had just entered with refreshments, saying to him in a voice which might have been heard by most of those in the apartment, " Set down the tray, Johnston, nobody wants it, and go round the room, begging they will all be silent while this lady sings." It was in the middle of the song which followed that Sir Edward and Lady Stephenson returned. The door opened without Agnes being aware of it ; and her rich voice swelling to a note at the top of its compass, and sustaining it with a power given to few, filled the chamber with a glorious volume of sound that held Colonel Hubert's sister transfixed as she was about to enter. Unconscious that there was another of the race near her, whom she would have almost breathed her soul away to please, Agnes warbled on, nor raised her eyes from the page before her till the strain was ended. Then she looked up and perceived Lady Stephenson, who had noiselessly crept round to ascertain whom the gifted minstrel might be, immediately opposite, and looking at her with a most gratifying expression of surprise and pleasure. A very cordial greeting and shaking of hands followed ; while Lady Elizabeth, her hand resting on her new favourite's shoulder, said almost in a whisper, " Who would have thought, Emily, that I should come at last to take lessons from you as to the selection of my natural curiosities ? But you have made a hit that does you immortal honour. This little singing bird is worth all the monsters I ever got together. Your ladyship need not look so grave, however," she added in a voice still lower. " I do not intend to treat her as if she were stolen from the Zoological Gardens. She is to come to me to morrow morning, and then we shall know all about her. I wish your fastidious brother were here. Do you remember what he said the other day about some miss he had heard at Clifton? I fancy we might have a chance of correcting his outrageous judgment concerning her. What think you ?" Lady Stephenson answered by expressing the most cordial admiration of Agnes's voice, but added, " There are many people coming in now, dear aunt. If Miss Willoughby will have the kindness to come to us to morrow, we shall enjoy hearing her much more than we can now, and I think she would like it better too." Agnes gave her a grateful look, and whispering in earnest, " Thank you," as she passed, glided back to the place she had left beside her aunt. " Upon my word, Miss Agnes, you are improving fast in impudence," said Mrs. Barnaby in her ear. " I desire, if you please, that next time you will wait till I bid you sing." Agnes did not reply. Nothing that it was in the power of her aunt to say could in that happy moment have caused her the slightest serious uneasiness. She was blessed beyond the reach of scolding ; which was the more fortunate, as the widow had seldom been in a more irritable mood. Quarter after quarter had heavily struck upon her ear from the timepiece on the marble slab behind her. 11 o'clock, the hour at which her carriage was ordered, approached with fearful strides, and yet Lord Mucklebury came not. Had her toilet upon this occasion been less fearfully expensive, she could have endured it better ; but that all the charms a milliner could give should have been freely ventured on, and he not see it, was hard to bear. It is true that, with the dogged firmness of a resolute purpose, Mrs. Barnaby scorned to shrink or tremble as she played her desperate game ; nevertheless, she knew that selling out stock 3 times within a fortnight was a strong measure ; and anything that seemed to check her approach to the goal she felt so sure of reaching, did produce a disagreeable sort of spasm about her heart. There was no help for it, however. Go she must, as nearly all the rest of the company had gone before her, with nothing to console her but an indifferently civil nod from Lady Elizabeth, and the surprise, less agreeable perhaps than startling, of seeing her dependent niece parted with in a manner that showed she was considered of infinitely greater importance than herself, notwithstanding her carriage, her tall footman, and her magnificent attire. Miss Morrison was accommodated with a seat in the carriage she had so actively exerted herself to procure, and the first words spoken after they drove off were hers. " N'est pas que j'ai raison? Did I not say so, Mrs. Barnaby? Did I not tell you, my dear madam, that you need do nothing but make this young lady sing in order to become the fashion at Cheltenham? You have no idea what a number of visits you will have to morrow. Nous verrons." " Really, Miss Morrison," replied the widow tartly, " I am surprised to hear a person of your good sense speak so foolishly. How can you suppose that a person in my station of life could desire the visits of such a set of people as we met to night ? And as to making this poor penniless girl talked of as a singer, I should be ashamed to think of such a thing. Remember, miss, if you please, that from this time forward I will never permit you to sing again ; unless, indeed, you mean to get your bread by it, and I'm sure I won't undertake to say but what you may want it. I can answer for nobody but myself; and I don't think it probable that others may be inclined to show the same devoted generosity that I have done to a girl that never showed the slightest affection for me in return." And so she ran on till she fell asleep ; but her words fell like rain on a waterproof umbrella. They made a noise, but they could not reach the head which they seemed destined to deluge. Agnes was wrapped in armour of proof, and nothing could do her harm. Happily for her, one of the facetious Lord Mucklebury's modes of extracting amusement from the widow was by writing her notes, which elicited answers that often threw him into a perfect ecstasy, and which he carefully preserved in an envelope endorsed Barnaby papers, lodging them in a corner of his writing desk, from whence they were not unfrequently drawn for the delectation of his particular friends. One of these notes, intended to produce an answer that should add a gem to his collection, was delivered to Mrs. Barnaby as she passed from the breakfast table of the boarding house to her own sitting room. The emotions produced by these notes were always very powerful, and on the present occasion more so than ordinary, for there were apologies for not appearing last night, and hopes for an interview that morning, which were to be answered instantly, for the servant waited. Mrs. Barnaby, panting with haste and gladness, seated herself at her table, opened her writing desk, seized a pen, and was in the very act of venturing the words, my dear lord, when Agnes drew near and said, " May I go out, aunt, to call on Lady Elizabeth ?"" Gracious heaven, what a moment to torment me ! Go where you will, plague of my life as you are. Get along at once, can't you ?" Agnes vanished, a Barnaby paper was written ; and while the niece was enjoying 3 hours of the most flattering and delightful intercourse with the nearest relations of Colonel Hubert, the aunt, with a degree of felicity hardly less perfect, was receiving a tete a tete visit from Lord Mucklebury, in which he as carefully studied her looks, attitudes, and words, as if their effect on him were all she believed them to be. Nor did either interview pass without producing some important results. His lordship carried away with him wherewithal to keep half a dozen of his friends who dined with him on that day in a continued roar for nearly an hour. Mrs. Barnaby was left with a sweet assurance that all was going well, which led to the purchase of a richly laced mantelet and a new bonnet ; while Agnes, inspired by so strong a wish to please as to make her follow the lead of her new friends, and converse with them of all her little history just as they wished to make her, created in them both an interest too strong to be ever forgotten, and she left them with a confidence in their kindness that made her endure much subsequent suffering with firmness ; for it was long ere she wholly lost the hope that they might meet again in future years. During the next fortnight this agreeable intercourse was very frequently repeated ; for there were few hours of the day in which Mrs. Barnaby was not in some way or other so occupied by the sentiment that engrossed her, either by the presence of its object, or the anticipation of his presence, or meditation upon it when it was past, that she was well pleased to have Agnes out of the way ; and Lady Elizabeth and her charming niece were, on the contrary, so well pleased to have her, that scarcely a day passed without some hours of it being devoted to them. Lady Stephenson in particular seemed to study her character with peculiar attention. There was a fond devotion in the gratitude which their kindness had produced that could not be mistaken, and which, from one so artless and so every way interesting, could not fail of producing affection in return. From such a friend it was impossible for Agnes to conceal, even if she had wished it, that her home was a very wretched one ; and they often conversed together on the possibility of her releasing herself from it by endeavouring to obtain some sort of independence by her own exertions. Lady Elizabeth was repeatedly a party in these consultations, but uniformly gave it as her opinion that any home was better for such a girl as Agnes, than an attempt to support herself, which must inevitably expose her to a degree of observation more dangerous than any annoyance from her aunt Barnaby. Agnes by no means clearly understood the grounds upon which this sturdy opposition to her wishes was founded ; and as Lady Stephenson, who seemed more able to sympathise with her actual sufferings, listened without venturing to answer these mysterious threatenings of something remote, she at length took courage herself, and said, " Will you tell me, dear Lady Elizabeth, what it is you think would happen to me if I went into a family as a governess ?"" You are a little fool, Agnes," replied the old lady, unable to repress a smile ;" but as I do really believe that your ignorance is genuine, I will tell you. Don't be frightened, my poor child ; but the fact is that you are a great deal too handsome for any such situation." Agnes blushed instantly a most celestial rosy red, and felt shocked and ashamed at having drawn forth such an answer ; but though she said nothing in reply, she at once decided that Lady Elizabeth Norris should never have reason to believe that she was capable of neglecting her friendly caution. All hopes from her power of teaching ended for ever, and the next time her aunt Barnaby was particularly cross, which happened that night while they were undressing to go to bed, Agnes very seriously began to revolve in her altered mind the possibility of learning so late in life the profitable mystery of satin stitch. Once, and once only, during the many hours Agnes passed with his relations, did she venture to pronounce the name of Colonel Hubert. She had often determined to do it, but had never found courage and opportunity till one morning, after an hour or two passed in singing duets with his sister, Lady Elizabeth again alluded to the Clifton Miss that her nephew had so vaunted, and whose voice must, she was sure, be so immeasurably inferior to that of Miss Willoughby. It was under cover of this observation that Agnes ventured to say, " I knew Colonel Hubert a little when I was at Clifton." " Did you ?" said the old lady briskly. " Then I'll bet my life he heard you sing." " Once or twice he did." " Oh, ha ! That explains it all. You need not blush so about it, my dear. Why did you not tell me so at once ?"" I do not think it is quite certain," returned Agnes, attempting to smile, " that Colonel Hubert spoke of me." " Don't you, my dear But I do, and I know him best, I suppose. And what was it you sang to him, Agnes?" Agnes mentioned the songs, but her voice trembled so that she grievously repented having brought on herself questions that she found it so difficult to answer. Her embarrassment was not greatly relieved by perceiving, when at length she looked up to save herself from the awkwardness of pertinaciously looking down, that the eyes of Lady Stephenson were earnestly fixed upon her. "Did you ever see Frederick Stephenson with my brother?" said her ladyship. "They were at Clifton together this summer. Perhaps you don't know that I was married there, Agnes, and Sir Edward and I left our two brothers there together." This change of subject was a considerable relief, and Agnes answered with tolerable composure, "Oh yes, I did know you were married there, for I heard it mentioned several times, and I saw you too, Lady Stephenson, the evening before you were married, walking up and down Gloucester Row with your brother." "Did you indeed? Were you walking there, Agnes?" "No, we were at the drawing room window, and my aunt made me look out to see your brother." "Why particularly to see my brother?" inquired Lady Stephenson with a smile. Because he was so tall, I believe," replied Agnes, looking considerably more silly than she had ever done in her life. "And so you watched us walking up and down, did you, Agnes?" "Yes, once or twice," answered Agnes, again blushing violently. "And did you hear what we said, my dear?" "No, but I am sure it was something very interesting, you seemed to be talking so earnestly." "It was very interesting. It was about Frederick." "You knew him too, did you not?" "Oh yes, very well." "Really? I wonder you never told me so before." It was impossible to look at Agnes at this moment as Lady Stephenson now looked at her, without perceiving that there must be some cause for the agitation she evinced. It immediately occurred to her that it was likely enough Frederick might have laid his heart at her feet, or perhaps stopped short before he did so, from the effect of that very conversation of which Agnes had been an eye, though not a near, witness. "Poor little thing," thought Lady Stephenson, "if this be so, and if she has given her young heart in return, how greatly is she to be pitied!" No sooner had this idea struck her, which many trifling circumstances tended to confirm, than Lady Stephenson determined to drop the subject for ever; and as much as Agnes secretly but tremblingly wished it, no allusion was ever made to the two gentlemen again. Days and weeks rolled on, till the time fixed by Lord Mucklebury for his departure arrived. His collection of the Barnaby papers was quite as copious as he wished it to be; and having indulged himself and his friends with as many good stories as any one lady could be the heroine of, without being fatiguing, he parted with the widow on Saturday evening, assuring her, with 1,000 expressions of passionate admiration, that he should be early on the walks to look for her on the morrow, and by noon on Sunday was on his road to London, behind 4 galloping post horses. During the whole of that fatal Sunday, Mrs. Barnaby roamed through all the public walks of Cheltenham with the disconsolate air of a pigeon whose mate has been shot. She was sad, cross, tender, and angry by turns; but never for a moment during that long dismal day did she ever once conceive the terrible idea that her intended mate was flown for ever. Nay, even on the morrow, when in answer to an inquiry at the reading room of whether Lord Mucklebury had been there that morning, the man replied, "I believe his lordship has left town, ma'am," not even then did her mind receive the terrible truth. It was from the hand of her friend Miss Morrison that the blow came at last. That lady on Wednesday evening entered her room, bringing a London newspaper with her. She was much irritated. "Mon Dieu, Mrs. Barnaby," she cried, "look here." The widow seized the paper with a trembling hand, and before she fainted, read as follows: Lord Viscount Mucklebury arrived this morning at Mivart's Hotel from Cheltenham. It is rumoured that his lordship is about to depart in a few days for the Continent, in order to pass the winter at Rome, but rather with the intention of kissing the hands of the beautiful Lady M S than the toe of his Holiness. End of Chapter 15. End of Volume 2. Recorded by Céline Major. Volume 3, Chapter 1 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Céline Major. Chapter 1. Mrs. Barnaby loses her senses, and recovers them. She takes a desperate resolution. Miss Morrison proves herself a friend in need. Agnes finds consolation in sorrow. Mrs. Barnaby's horror on recovering her senses, for she really did fall into a swoon, was in very just proportion to the extent of the outlay her noble vision had cost her. To Miss Morrison, who had listened to all her hopes, she scrupled not to manifest her despair, not, however, entering into the financial part of it, but leaving it to be understood by her sympathizing friend that her agony proceeded wholly from disappointed love. " What a Lovelace! What a Lothario! What a finished deceiver! Quelle horreur! " exclaimed the pitying spinster. " And how thankful ought I to be that no man can ever again cause me such terrible emotion! No, jamais! Gracious Heaven, what is to become of me? " cried Mrs. Barnaby, apparently but little consoled by this assurance of her friend's exemption from a similar misfortune. " What ought I to do, Miss Morrison? If I set off instantly for London, do you think I could reach it before he leaves for Rome? " Miss Morrison, having turned to the newspaper, examined its date, and read the fatal paragraph again, and replied, " You certainly could, my dear Mrs. Barnaby, if this statement be correct, but I would not do it, if I were you, without thinking very seriously about it. It is true I never had a lord for a lover myself, but I believe when they run restive, they are exceedingly difficult to hold, and if you do go after him, and fail at last to touch his cruel heart, you will be only worse off than you are now. C'est clair." " That may be all very true in one sense, Miss Morrison," replied the unhappy widow, " but there is such a thing as pursuing a man lawfully for breach of promise of marriage, and, though money is no object to me, I should glory in getting damages from him, if only to prove to the world that he is a scoundrel." " That is quite another thing indeed," said the confidante, " tout a fait. And if you mean to bring an action against him, I am pretty sure that I could be very useful to you, for my brother is an attorney in London, and is reckoned particularly clever about everything of the kind. But have you any proof, my dear lady? That is what my brother will be sure to say to you. I know you have had lots of letters, and if you have kept them all, it is most likely my brother may find out something like proof. Il est si habile." " Proof? To be sure I have proof enough, if that's all that's wanted ; and I'll go to your brother at once, Miss Morrison, for revenge I'll have, if nothing else." " Then of course you'll take all his love letters with you, Mrs. Barnaby ; and I think, if you would let me look over them, I should be able to tell you whether they would answer the purpose or not. Je m'y connais un peu." " I should have no objection in the world to your seeing them every one," replied the outraged lady ;" but I am thinking, Miss Morrison, that I have an immense deal of business to do, and that I shall never get through it without your friendly help, I am thinking." And Mrs. Barnaby was thinking, and very much to the purpose too. She was thinking that though she had squandered about £70 or £80 in trifling purchases, by far the greater part of the expenses her noble lover had induced her to run into were still in the shape of debts, the money with which she proposed to discharge them being as yet paying her interest in the funds. Could she contrive to leave the heaviest of these debts unpaid till she knew the result of her intended attack upon Lord Mucklebury's purse, it would be very convenient. Perhaps some vague notion that she, too, might visit the Continent, and thus escape the necessity of paying them at all, might mix itself with her meditations. But at any rate she very speedily decided upon leaving Cheltenham the following day, without mentioning her intention to her milliner, mercer, tailor, shoemaker, hosier, perfumer, livery stable keeper, librarian, or even to her hairdresser. If she got damages, she should certainly return and pay them all with great eclat. If not, circumstances must decide what it would be most advisable for her to do. Great as was her esteem and affection for Miss Morrison, she did not think it necessary to trouble her with all these trifling details, but resumed the conversation by saying, " Yes, my dear Miss Morrison, I am thinking that the best thing I can do will be to go to London for a day or two, see your brother, put all my documents into his hands, and then return to Cheltenham for the remainder of the season, for I am sure I should be more likely to recover my spirits in your friendly society than anywhere else." " Indeed, I approve your resolution altogether," replied Miss Morrison, " and I will write a line by you to my brother, telling him that whatever he does to assist you I shall take as a personal favour to myself." " I cannot thank you enough," said the widow, pressing her hand. " We shall be able to get everything ready to night, I hope ; and when my coachman comes as usual for orders at 11 o'clock to morrow morning, tell him, my dear friend, to drive you about wherever you like to go. and you may mention, if you please, that I shall want him to take us a long drive on Saturday to see the Roman pavement. I mean to return on Friday night, for what will be the use, you know, of my staying in town?" "None in the world, but I think you had better name Monday for the drive, for fear you should be too tired on Saturday." "Well, just as you please about that, but you had better go and write your letter, and I'll speak to Agnes and my maid about packing. Perhaps you will not like to take Miss Willoughby, I will take the greatest care of her, if you will leave her in my charge." "How very kind! But I would rather take her. I can't do without somebody to lace my stays and fasten my dress, and I want my maid to finish the work she is about. She is an exquisite darner, and I have set her to mend the rent that hateful Lord Mucklebury made in my India muslin. So I don't mean to take her." Nothing of any kind occurred to interfere with the execution of this hastily but by no means unskilfully imagined plan. The ready money expenditure of Mrs. Barnaby had been so lavish that she had bought golden opinions from master, mistress, men, and maids throughout the establishment, and when she summoned Mr. , the landlord, to her presence, and informed him that she was going to London for a couple of days on business, but should not give up her rooms, as she should take neither of her servants with her, he received the communication with great satisfaction, and promised that no one but her own people should enter her drawing room till her return. This preliminary business happily settled, Mrs. Barnaby mounted the stairs to her bedroom, where, as usual, she found Agnes busily occupied in her corner, the hour for an evening engagement made with Lady Stephenson not having yet arrived. For some reason or other, Mrs. Barnaby never enjoyed any flirtation so much in the presence of Agnes as without her; and it was for this reason that at Cheltenham, as well as at Clifton, she had encouraged her making acquaintance for herself. Thus her constant intercourse with Lady Elizabeth Norris and Lady Stephenson had never in any degree been impeded by her aunt. Mrs. Barnaby was aware that Agnes had engaged to pass this evening with them, and when she looked at her tranquil face as she entered the room she felt greatly disposed to plague her by saying that she must stay at home to pack, and could not go. But a moment's reflection suggested to her that the less fuss she made about this packing the better, and therefore only told her that she was obliged to set off by 7 o'clock the next morning for London, on business that would detain her for a day or two, that she meant to take her and leave her maid, and that before she set off upon her gossiping visit it would be necessary to pack her trunk. Agnes laid down her book and looked surprised. "Don't stare so like a fool, Agnes. Do what I bid you instantly." "There will be no occasion for me to pack much, aunt, if we are only to stay a day or two," said Agnes. "When I tell you to pack your trunk, miss, I mean that your trunk shall be packed, and I won't trouble you to give me any opinion on the subject." "Am I to put everything into it, aunt?" "Plague of my life, yes," replied Mrs. Barnaby, whose vexed spirit seemed to find relief in speaking harshly. Without further remonstrance Agnes set about obeying her, and the little all that formed her morning wardrobe was quickly transferred from the 2 drawers allowed her to the identical trunk which Aunt Betsy had provided for her first journey from Silverton to Empton. "And my books, aunt?" said Agnes, fixing her eyes on the heated countenance of the widow with some anxiety. Mrs. Barnaby hesitated, and Agnes saw she did. It was not because the little library of her niece formed the chief happiness of her life that she scrupled at bidding her leave them behind, but because she suspected that they, and their elegant little case, were of some marketable value. "You may take them if you will," she said at length. "I don't care a straw what you take or what you leave, only don't plague me. You must know, I suppose, if you are not quite an idiot, that when people go to London on business, it is possible they may stay longer than they expect." Agnes asked no more questions, but quietly packed up everything that belonged to her, and when the work, no very long one, was completed, she said, "Can I be of any use to you, aunt, before I go out?" "I should like to know what use you are ever likely to be of to anybody," was the reply. "Take yourself off, in God's name. The sooner the better." The very simple toilette of Agnes was soon arranged, and having left everything in perfect order for departure, she uttered a civil but unanswered "Good bye, aunt," and went away. It so chanced that a little volume of poems lent to her by Lady Stephenson had been left in the drawing room, and Agnes, wishing to return it before leaving Cheltenham, entered the room to look for it. As a good many circulating library volumes were lying about, it was some minutes before she found it, and just as she had succeeded and was leaving the apartment, Miss Morrison appeared at the door. She had a letter in her hand, and a bustling, busy look and manner, which led Agnes to suppose that she had something of consequence to say to her aunt. " Shall I run up stairs and desire my aunt to come to you, Miss Morrison ?" said she. " No, thank you, my dear, you are very kind, but I think I had better go up to her. I only stepped in first to see if she was here. She is very busy packing, I suppose, and perhaps I can help her." " Then you know, Miss Morrison, that she is going to London to morrow ?" said Agnes. "Oh dear, yes. I believe it was I put it into her head first, and this is the letter she is to take to my brother. I am sure I hope she'll succeed with all my heart, and I should like to hear that Lord Mucklebury had £10,000 to pay her for damages." " Damages ?" repeated Agnes. " What for ?"" What for, my dear child ? Why, for having used her so abominably ill, to be sure. There is nobody that saw them together as I did, but must have supposed he intended to marry her." " And if he has used her ill, Miss Morrison," said Agnes, looking greatly alarmed, " will it not be exposing herself still more if she goes to law about it ? Indeed, Miss Morrison, you should not advise her to do anything so very wrong and disagreeable." " Don't blame me, my dear, I beg of you. The idea was quite her own tout a fait, I assure you, and all I have done to further it was just writing this letter to my brother for her. He is a very clever lawyer, and I'm sure she could not do better." " It would be much better, Miss Morrison, if she did not do anything," said Agnes, while tears started to her eyes at the idea of this fresh exposure. " I don't think, my dear Miss Agnes, that you can be much of a judge," retorted the adviser. " However, as you do choose to give an opinion upon the subject, and seem to be so very much afraid that she should expose herself, I must just tell you that you owe it to me if she does not go galloping after Lord Mucklebury all the way to Rome. She had the greatest possible inclination to do so, I assure you. However, I think that I have put it out of her head by talking to her of damages. But you are going down stairs, and I am going up, so good bye. Don't frighten yourself more than is needful. It is likely as not that you will never be called into court. Au revoir." Agnes, sick at heart, and trembling for the future, repaired to the house of Lady Elizabeth. Lady Stephenson was at the pianoforte, and the old lady reading near a window ; but as soon as her young guest was announced, she closed her volume, and said, " You are late, little girl. We have been expecting you this hour, and this is the last evening we shall have quietly to ourselves ; for Colonel Hubert writes us word that he is coming to morrow, and he is a much more stay at home person than Sir Edward." Colonel Hubert coming to Cheltenham the very day she was to leave it ! These were not tidings to cheer her spirits, already agitated and depressed, and when she attempted to speak, she burst into tears. Lady Stephenson was at her side in a moment. " Agnes," she said, " what ails you ? You are as white as a ghost. Had you heard any agitating news before you came here ?" Struck by the accent with which this was spoken, and perceiving in a moment that Lady Stephenson thought the mention of Colonel Hubert's arrival had caused her emotion, she hastened to reply, and did so perhaps with more frankness than she might have known had she not been particularly anxious to prove that there were other and very sufficient reasons for her discomposure. " News most painful and most sad to me, Lady Stephenson," she said. " I believe you have heard my aunt Barnaby's foolish flirtation with Lord Mucklebury spoken of. Lady Elizabeth was laughing about it the other day." " And who was not, my dear ? The saucy viscount has made her, they say, the subject of a ballad. But is it for this you weep ? Or is it because he is gone away, and that there's an end of it ?"" Alas ! Lady Elizabeth, there is not an end of it, and it is for that I weep ; though indeed I ought to beg your pardon for bringing such useless sorrow here. But I find that my aunt fancies she has a claim upon him, a legal claim, and that she is going to London to morrow to bring an action against him." " Is it possible ?" exclaimed the old lady, looking at poor Agnes with very genuine compassion. " God knows you may well weep, my poor child. I shall begin to think I gave but sorry advice, Agnes, when I told you to stay with her. It may, after all, be better to run some risk in leaving her, than brave certain disgrace and ridicule by remaining to reside in her family." " Is she going to take you to town with her, Agnes ?" inquired Lady Stephenson, with a look of deep concern. " Yes, Lady Stephenson, I am to go with her." There was a very painful silence for a minute or two. Both the admiring friends of Agnes would have done much to save her from being a sharer in such an enterprise. But to interfere with the indisputable authority of such a woman as Mrs. Barnaby in her arrangements concerning a niece, who had no dependence upon her, was out of the question, and the conviction that it was so kept them silent. " How did you hear this strange story, my dear ?" said Lady Elizabeth. " Did your aunt explain to you her ridiculous purpose herself?" " No, Lady Elizabeth. She only bade me prepare my trunk for going to London with her. It was Miss Morrison, whom I met by chance as I came out, who told me the object of the journey ; and dreadful as this going to law would be, it is not the worst thing I fear." " What worse can there be, Agnes ?" said Lady Stephenson. " I am almost ashamed to tell you of such fears ; but when I uttered something like a reproach to Miss Morrison for having advised this journey, and writing a letter about it to her brother, who is a lawyer in London, she told me that I ought to be grateful to her for preventing my aunt's following Lord Mucklebury all the way to Rome, for that such was her first intention, and," continued Agnes, bursting anew into tears, " I greatly, greatly suspect that she has not given up this intention yet." The two ladies exchanged glances of pity and dismay, and Lady Elizabeth, making her a sign to come close to her, took her kindly by the hand, saying, in accents much more gentle than she usually bestowed on any one, " My poor dear girl, what makes you think this ? Tell me, Agnes, tell me all they have said to you." Agnes knelt down on the old lady's footstool, and gently kissing the venerable hand which held hers, said, " It is very, very kind of you to let me tell you all, and your judgment will be more to be trusted than mine as to what it may mean. But my reason for thinking that my aunt is going to do more than she confesses to Miss Morrison is, that she has publicly declared her intended absence will be only for 2 days ; and yet, though she told me this too, she ordered me to pack up everything I had, even the little collection of books I told you of, Lady Stephenson ; and, moreover, instead of letting her maid put up her things, I left her doing it herself, and saw her before I came away putting a vast variety of her most valuable things in a great travelling trunk, that she could never think of taking, if it were really her intention to stay in London only 2 days, and then return to Cheltenham." " Very suspicious, very much so indeed," said the old lady ;" and all I can say to you in reply, my poor child, is this — you must not go abroad with her. I am not rich enough to charge myself with providing for you, nor must your friend Emily here frighten her new husband by talking of taking possession of you, Agnes ; but you must not go abroad with that woman. Governess you must be, I suppose, if things go on in this way ; and instead of opposing it, I will try if I cannot find a situation in which you may at least be safer than with this aunt Barnaby. Whatever happens, you must let us hear from you ; and remember, the moment you discover that she really proposes to take you abroad, you are to put yourself into a Cheltenham coach, and come directly to me." What words were these for Agnes to listen to? Colonel Hubert was to take up his residence in that house on the morrow, and she was now told in a voice of positive command, that if what she fully expected would happen, did happen, she was at once to seek a shelter there. She dared not trust her voice to say, " I thank you," but she ventured to raise her eyes to the hard featured but benignant countenance that bent over her, and the kiss she received on her forehead proved that though her silence might not be fully understood, her gratitude was not doubted. The evening was not, like many others recently passed there, so happy, that Mrs. Barnaby's footman often came to escort her home before she thought the time for parting could be half arrived. They had no music, no scraps of poetry in Italian or in English, as touchstones of taste and instruction, with which Lady Stephenson loved to test the powers of her young favourite ; but the conversation rested almost wholly upon the gloomy and uncertain future. At length the moment came in which she was to bid these valued friends adieu. They embraced and blessed her with tenderness, nay, even with tears ; but little did they guess the tumult that swelled the breast of Agnes. It was Hubert's sister to whom she clung ; it was Hubert's aunt, almost his mother, who hung over her, looking as if she were her mother too. And on the morrow he would be with them, and he would hear her named ; for notwithstanding their unmeasured superiority to her in all ways, they could not forget her so soon. He would hear of her sorrows, of the dangers that surrounded her ; and he would hear too, perhaps, of the shelter offered her in the very house he dwelt in. All these thoughts were busy in her head as she uttered the last farewell, and turned again in passing through the door to look once more on those who would so soon be looked at by him. There was certainly a strange pleasure mixed with all this sadness, for though she wept through half the night, she would not have exchanged the consciousness of having been brought nearer to him, even by the act of having mingled tears in parting with his nearest relations, for all the enjoyment that a tranquil spirit and a calm night's rest could offer in exchange for it. End of chapter 1. Volume 3, Chapter 2 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Mrs. Barnaby effects her retreat from Cheltenham. She carries with her a letter. Its effect: an amiable attorney. Specimens of a noble style of letter writing. Consolation. Though the baggage of Mrs. Barnaby was strangely disproportionate to the period she had named for her absence, it seemed not to excite suspicion, which might, perhaps, be owing to the well-known splendour of her elaborate toilette, which she not unfrequently changed 4 times in a day, requiring, as all who thought on the subject must be aware, an extent of travelling equipment much exceeding the portion assigned to ordinary ladies. So she passed forth unchallenged, and unchallenged saw her treasures deposited on roof and in rumble-tumble, till all were stowed away. And then, having affectionately squeezed the hand of Miss Morrison, who accompanied her to the stage, she climbed into it, followed by the pale and melancholy Agnes. Our widow was now beginning to be an experienced traveller, and her first care on reaching London was to secure rooms in a private lodging-house. Notwithstanding the noble visions with which she had recreated her fancy during the last month, she now with great good sense sent them all to the moon, knowing she could easily call them back again if all went well with her, but determined that they should in no way interfere with her enjoyment of the more substantial goods that were still within her reach. So she commissioned the maid of the house to procure her 3 dozen of oysters and a pot of porter, with which, while Agnes wept herself to sleep, she repaid herself for her day's fatigue, and wisely laid in a stock of strength for the morrow. Her first object, of course, was to hold communication with the brother of her friend, Magnus Morrison, Esquire, attorney at law, Red Lion Square. Such was the address the letter entrusted to her bore; and at breakfast the following morning she sat gazing at it for some minutes before she could decide whether it would be better to convey it herself, or prepare the lawyer to receive her, by letting it precede her for a few hours. She finally decided to send it before her, the wisdom of which determination will be evident upon the perusal of the letter, such an introduction being well calculated to ensure all the zealous attention she desired. Miss Morrison's letter ran thus: My dear brother, I never fail, as you well know, to catch all the fish for your net that comes in my way, croyez cela toujours, and I now send you a client whom I have little doubt you will find answer in every way. She is a most charming woman, and my most particular friend. I don't know a more charming person anywhere, not even in my dear Paris, so rich, so free in all her expenses, so remarkably obliging, and so very handsome for all those who admire tall, large beauties. But you are too good a lawyer to listen to all this when business is in hand, and so I must come au fait. And now, Magnus, be sure to attend to every word. Mrs. Barnaby, this charming friend of mine, has for the last month been receiving the most marked and the most tender attentions from Lord Mucklebury. He is a viscount, my dear Magnus, and observe, as rich as a Jew. This nobleman has given her, poor dear lady, every reason in the world to believe that his dearest wish, hope, and intention was to marry her, and she, good, tender-hearted creature, perfectly adored him, devoting every hour of the day to the finding out where he was to be seen, and the going there to see him. She had no secrets whatever from me the whole time, and I knew everything that was going on from the first moment he ever kissed her hand to the most tender interviews that ever passed between them. And how do you think it has all ended? Oh, Magnus, it is impossible to deny that the male sex, lords and all, are most dreadfully deceitful and false-hearted. All this devoted love going on, as I tell you, for a whole month, has just ended in nothing. My lord set off in his travelling carriage with 4 horses and an outrider, as we subsequently ascertained, without even taking any leave of the lady at all, or explaining himself the least bit either one way or the other. You may easily guess her feelings. Her first idea, poor thing, was to follow him to the world's end, for there is no doubt in the world that her attachment was one of the most sincere kind. But luckily she confided this romantic thought to me, and it struck me directly, Magnus, that the best thing in the world for her to do would be to put the whole affair into your hands. She has got quantities of his letters, they are very little letters, to be sure, folded up sometimes not much bigger than a shilling ; but still letters are letters, you know. And I can't but think that with your cleverness something might be made of an action for damages. Of course it is natural to suppose that I am a little partial to this sort of measure, because I can't well have forgotten yet that the best part of my snug little fortune came to me in the same way, thanks to the good management of our dear good father, Magnus. The dear lady listened to reason in a minute, and consented to put herself in your hands, for which reason she is going to set off for London to morrow morning. She will bring all Lord Mucklebury's letters with her, and it will be for you to judge what use can be made of them. Only it is but right to mention that there is no doubt in the world but that Mrs. Barnaby is quite rich enough to pay handsomely, whether she gains the cause or loses it. I am, my dear Magnus, your affectionate sister, Sarah Morrison. Mrs. Barnaby enclosed this letter in an envelope, in which she wrote: Mrs. Barnaby presents her compliments to Mr. Magnus Morrison, and will be happy to see him on the business to which the enclosed letter refers at any hour he will name. No. 5, Half Moon Street, Piccadilly. Having consigned her packet to the post, the widow declared to her anxious companion that she did not mean to waste her time as long as she remained in London, but should walk to every part of the town, and should expect her to do the same. " Will there not be danger of losing ourselves, aunt ?" said Agnes. " London, you know, is so much bigger than any place you ever saw." " And what's the good of that piece of wisdom, Miss Solomon ? Perhaps you don't know that I have a tongue in my head, and that the Londoners speak English. Come and put on your bonnet, if you please, and I'll promise not to leave you in any of the gutters, but bring you safe home again to No. 5, Half Moon Street, Piccadilly. There, you see, I shall know what place to ask for. Won't that do for you ?" Agnes felt that all remonstrance would be in vain, and submitted ; though the idea of being dragged through the streets of London by her aunt Barnaby, dressed in the identical green satin gown and pink feathers which had first attracted Lord Mucklebury's attention, was by no means an agreeable prospect. The expedition, however, fatiguing and disagreeable as it proved, was achieved without any very disastrous results. Mrs. Barnaby, indeed, was twice very nearly knocked down by a cab, while staring too eagerly about her when crossing the streets ; and friendly as was the old black crape veil of poor Agnes, it could not wholly save her from some tolerably obvious efforts to find out whether the face it sheltered was worthy the graceful symmetry of the person who wore it ; but they nevertheless reached their Half Moon Street without any positive injury to life or limb. At 8 o'clock in the evening, while Mrs. Barnaby and her weary companion were taking tea, the drawing room door opened, and Mr. Magnus Morrison was announced, and most cordially welcomed by the widow, who not only saw in him the lawyer from whom she hoped to learn how to replenish her waning finances, but also the brother of her dear Miss Morrison, and the only acquaintance she could hope at this trying moment to find or make in London. But now, as heretofore, the presence of Agnes was inconvenient, which she took care to signify by saying to the lawyer, " I am greatly indebted to you, Mr. Morrison, for your early attention to my note, and I shall be very glad to talk with you on the business that brings me to London, but not quite yet, we really must be quite by ourselves, for it will be necessary that I should have your whole attention. Will you, in the meantime, permit me to offer you tea?" Before Mr. Morrison could reply, Agnes was on her feet, and asking her aunt in a whisper if she would give her leave to go to bed. " Yes, if you like it, my darling," replied Mrs. Barnaby, whose tenderness for her niece was always awakened by the presence of strangers. " I am sure you look tired to death. But bring down first, my dear, my writing desk ; and remember, my love, to take care that I have warm water when I come up. And don't forget, Agnes, to put my bonnet and shawl, and all that, nicely away, and see that I have paper for curling my hair ready on the dressing table ; and don't go to bed till you have put out my lilac silk for to morrow ; and just put a stitch in the blonde of my bonnet cap, for I have pulled it almost off." All this was said by the widow in a coaxing sort of half whisper, with an arm round her victim's waist, and a smile of the most fascinating kindness on her own lips. The desk was brought, and the consulting parties left alone ; while Agnes, as she performed the different tasks imposed on her, and which her great fatigue rendered heavy, could not for an instant banish from her mind the question that had incessantly haunted her from the hour she left the drawing room of Lady Elizabeth. " Will she go abroad ? Shall I be obliged to return to Cheltenham without her ? Shall I be obliged to go to the house where he is living Mr. Magnus Morrison was by no means an ill-looking man, and though a bachelor of 35, had as little of quizzical peculiarity about him as careful attorney of that age, unpolished by a wife, can be expected to have. Mrs. Barnaby, though a little his senior, was still, as we know, a lady a pretensions, and never permitted any gentleman to approach her without making an experiment upon him with her fine eyes. Their success in the present instance was neither so violent as in the case of Major Allen, nor so instantaneous as in that of the false-hearted peer. Nevertheless, enough was achieved to throw an agreeable sort of extraneous interest into the business before them, and the widow disdained, not as it proceeded to decorate her narrative and herself with such graces as none but a Mrs. Barnaby can display. Having given her own version, and with such flourishes as her nature loved, of Lord Mucklebury's violent passion for her, she asked her attentive and somewhat captivated auditor what species of testimony was required to prove a promise of marriage in such a manner as to secure large damages, for without being quite certain of obtaining such, you must be aware, my dear sir, that a woman of my station, connections, and fortune, could not think of appearing in court." " Assuredly not," replied Mr. Magnus Morrison fervently. " Such a measure is never to be resorted to unless the evidence is of a nature that no cross examination can set aside. My sister tells me, madam, that you have letters." " Yes, Mr. Morrison, I have many, though I am sorry to say that many more have been destroyed." This was a figure of poetry, and of a kind that the widow often adopted to give strength to the narrative portion of her conversation. " That is greatly to be regretted, Mrs. Barnaby, though we must hope that among those which remain sufficient proof of this very atrocious case will be found to answer the purposes of justice. Was there any principle of selection in the manner in which some were preserved and others destroyed ?"" I can hardly say," replied the lady, " that it was done on any principle, unless the feeling can be so called which leads a woman of delicacy to blush and shrink from preserving the effusions of a passion so vehement as that expressed in some of the letters of Lord Mucklebury." " They were, then, the most ardent declarations of his attachment that you destroyed, Mrs. Barnaby ?"" Most certainly," said the widow, throwing her eyes upon the carpet. " It is unfortunate, very unfortunate," observed the lawyer, " though it shows a delicacy of mind that it is impossible not to admire. Will you give me leave, madam, to peruse such of the letters as you have preserved ?"" Undoubtedly," replied Mrs. Barnaby, unlocking her writing desk ;" and though I know not how to regret the existence of such feelings, Mr. Morrison, I will not deny that, for the sake of honour and justice, I am sorry now that what I have to show you is so much the least explicit part of the correspondence." She then drew forth the packet, which contained, be it spoken in confidence, every syllable ever addressed to her by the laughter-loving Viscount ; and greatly as Mr. Magnus Morrison began to feel interested in the case, and much as he would have liked to bring so charming a client into court, he very soon perceived that there was nothing in these highly scented but diminutive feuilles volantes at all likely to produce any effect on a jury approaching to that elicited by the evidence of the learned and celebrated Sergeant Buzfuz on an occasion somewhat similar. He continued to read them all, however, and they were numerous, with the most earnest attention and unwearied industry, permitting little or no emotion of any kind to appear on his countenance as he proceeded, and determined to utter no word approaching to an opinion till he had carefully perused them all. Important as Mrs. Barnaby flattered herself these little letters might eventually prove, and interesting as her lawyer found every word of them, the whole collection might perhaps be considered as somewhat wearisome, full of repetition, and even trifling, by the general reader, for which reason a few only shall be selected as specimens, taken at hazard, and without any attention either to their dates or the particular events which led to them. No. 1. Prima Donna del Mondo. *. Lord Mucklebury had been assured on the authority of Mrs. Barnaby herself that her favourite language was the Italian. Walk you to day? At 3 be it, at which hour my station will be the library. M. No. 2. Bellissima. Should I appear to day, you may guess where, with a friend on my arm, let it not change the sweet demeanour of my charming widow. He is an excellent fellow, but one whom I always treat as if he were not in existence ; for in truth, being almost as dreadfully in love as myself, he neither sees nor hears. M. No. 3. Belladonna. It is 3 days since I received a line from the fairest lady in Cheltenham. Write me a whole page, I beseech you. and let it be such a one as shall console me under the necessity of dining and passing the whole evening with half a dozen he fellows, when the champagne will but ill atone for the sparkling eyes whose light I shall lose by being among them. But if I have one of your exquisite billets in my waistcoat pocket, I shall bear the loss better. M. No. 4. Vidova maravigliosa. Should I find the Barnaby disengaged in her saloon, were my audacious feet to bear me across its threshold this evening. M. Such and such like were the manuscripts submitted by Mrs. Barnaby to the inspection of her lawyer. When he had carefully and deliberately gone through the whole collection, he tied them all up again with a bit of rose-colored ribbon, as he had found them, and pushing them back to her across the table, said, with something like a sigh, "It is greatly to be lamented, madam, that some of these little notes had not been consigned to the flames instead of the letters you have described to me, for my judgment decidedly is, that although every one of these documents tends to prove the admiration of their author for the lady to whom they are addressed, there is not one of them which can be said to contain a positive promise of marriage, or even, I fear, any implied intention of making a proposal, so that I am afraid we should not get a verdict against my Lord Mucklebury on the strength of any evidence contained therein. Nevertheless, if you have witnesses to prove that such proposal and such promise have been actually made to you by his lordship, I think these letters might help us to make out a very pretty case, and one which, if it did not eventually bring you a large sum of money, would at least be exceedingly vexatious to his lordship, a circumstance which might in some degree tend to soothe the naturally outraged feelings of so charming a lady, so villainously treated." Mr. Morrison said this with his eyes fixed steadily on the widow's face, intending to ascertain what chance there might be of her wishing to spend a few £100 for the pleasure of plaguing her perfidious deluder; but he could make out nothing from this scrutiny. Nevertheless, the mind of Mrs. Barnaby was busily at work. So many schemes, however, were battling together in her brain, that the not being able to discover which preponderated showed no want of skill in the lawyer. First, she had a very strong inclination for a personal interview with Lord Mucklebury, in order to see how a little passionate grief might affect him. Secondly, she greatly desired to profit by the present occasion for seeing some of those London sights which country ladies and gentlemen so love to talk about. Thirdly, she very ardently wished to avoid the necessity of paying the debts which his lordship's base delusions had induced her to contract at Cheltenham. Fourthly, and lastly, the project of a journey to Rome was beginning to take a very decided shape in her fancy; but amidst all this there remained not the smallest wish or intention of trying to revenge her wrongs by the assistance of the law. She was beginning to be too well aware of the melting nature of money in the funds, to wish that the villainous Viscount should lead her to expend another shilling upon him. After the silence of a few minutes, Mrs. Barnaby raised her eyes from the ground, and fixing them with a soft, gentle, resigned smile upon Mr. Morrison, said, "I thank you gratefully, Mr. Morrison, for your frank opinion, given too in so gentlemanlike a manner as to make me feel that I am indeed rather in the hands of a friend than a lawyer, and in return I will use the same frankness with you. I have loved Lord Mucklebury most sincerely, loved him with all the pure, disinterested ardour of my character. But the same warm heart, Mr. Morrison, which thus surrenders itself without suspicion or restraint, is precisely of the nature most prompt to reject and forget a being proved to be unworthy of it. Therefore I may now truly say, that this poor bosom," pressing her two hands upon it, "suffers more from the void within it than from tender regret; and I am greatly inclined, since I cannot benefit by your able services as a lawyer, to urge my friendship with your dear sister as a claim upon your kindness as a gentleman. Will you assist to cure the painful void I speak of by giving me your help in my endeavours to see all that is best worth looking at in London? I am sure it would do me good, not to mention that it might give pleasure to the dear child whom you saw with me when you entered. She is quite my idol, and I should delight in procuring her an amusement which I know she would so particularly enjoy." Mr. Morrison, who was a shrewd, quick-sighted man, thought there was considerable food for speculation in this speech, and had leisure served him, he might have reasoned upon it in a spirit not much unlike that of Benedict. "Will you assist to cure the painful void, which is as much as to say," and so on. He waited not, however, to give this all the attention it merited, but remembering clearly his sister's statement respecting the widow's fortune, replied with most obliging readiness, There is nothing, my dear madam, that I would not joyfully do to prove my wish of serving a lady so highly esteemed by my sister, and one also, permit me to add, so deserving the admiration of all the world," replied the gallant attorney. " Well, then, my dear sir," rejoined the widow, in accents of renewed cheerfulness, " I throw myself entirely upon you, and shall be quite ready to begin to morrow to go here, there, and everywhere, exactly as you command." A scheme for St. Paul's and the Tower in the morning, and one of the theatres at night, was then sketched out ; and the gentleman departed, by no means certain that this adventure might not terminate by being one of the most important of his life. CHAPTER III. Volume 3, Chapter 3 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER III. A bold measure. A tour de force on the part of Mrs. Barnaby, and of savoir faire on that of Lord Mucklebury. Sight seeing. The widow resolves upon another journey. Mr. Morrison, who really had a little business, though not very much, had named 2 o'clock as the earliest hour at which he should be able to come to Half Moon Street, for the purpose of escorting the ladies in a hackney coach to the City ; and it was during the hours that intervened between her breakfast and this time that the active-minded Mrs. Barnaby determined upon making a private visit to Mivart's Hotel in the hope of seeing Lord Mucklebury. She had quite made up her mind to the worst, as may be seen from the projects already maturing themselves in her brain, as the consequence. Nevertheless, she thought it was just possible that his lordship might be unable to resist the expression of sorrow in eyes he had so vehemently admired ; and at any rate there was something so touching in the idea of this final interview, that she could not refuse herself the satisfaction of making the experiment. Telling Agnes that she had a little shopping to do before their sight seeing began, and that she would not take her for fear she should be as stupidly fatigued as on the night before, she mounted to her bedroom, adorned herself in the most becoming costume she could devise, and with somewhat less rouge than usual, that the trader might see how sorrow worked, set forth on her expedition. Having reached Piccadilly, she called a coach, and in a few minutes was safely deposited before Mivart's door. " Is Lord Mucklebury here ?" she inquired in a voice of authority of the first official she encountered. " Yes, ma'am," was the answer. " His lordship is at breakfast." " I must see him, if you please, directly." " It is by appointment, ma'am ?" questioned the discreet waiter, looking at her keenly. " His lordship is just going to set off, and is too busy, I believe, to see anybody." " He is not too busy to see me. I must see him directly." " Is it an appointment ?" repeated the man, in an accent not the most respectful. " Yes, it is," replied the unblushing widow. " Better call his own man Joe," said another napkin functionary, attracted by the appearance of the lady. " You had better take this sovereign," said Mrs. Barnaby in a whisper. Apparently the man thought this advice the best ; for, taking the coin with such practised dexterity as hardly to make the action perceptible, he gave the lady a look with his knowing eye, that said, " Follow me," and slid away among the passages and stairs till he had marshalled her to the door of Lord Mucklebury's apartments. Being probably somewhat doubtful whether the office he had performed would be as gratefully requited by the gentleman as by the lady, he waited not to open the door, but saying, " There's his room," disappeared, leaving Mrs. Barnaby to announce her ill-used self. She was a little frightened, but still resolute ; and after pausing for one moment to recover her breath, threw open the door, and entered. The waiter's account was strictly true, for his lordship was at breakfast, and his lordship was packing. En robe de chambre, with a cup of coffee in one hand, and a bunch of keys in the other, he was standing beside his valet, who knelt before a carriage seat he was endeavouring to close. Lord Mucklebury was facing the door, and raised his eyes as it opened. The sight that greeted them was assuredly unexpected, but the nerve with which he bore it did honour to his practised philosophy. " Mrs. Barnaby !" he exclaimed, with a smile, in which his valet seemed to take a share, for the fellow turned his head away to conceal its effect upon him. " Mrs. Barnaby, how very kind this is ! But I grieve such obliging benevolence should be shown, at a moment when I have so little leisure to express my gratitude. My dear lady, I am this instant starting for the Continent." " I know it, sir, I know it but too well," replied the widow, considerably embarrassed by his easy tone. " Permit me, however, to speak to you for one moment before you set out." " Assuredly. Place yourself on this sofa, Mrs. Barnaby. How deeply I regret that moment so delightful. Confound you, Rawlins, you'll break those hinges to pieces if you force them so. My dear lady, I am shocked to death, but upon my soul I have not a moment to spare. I wish to speak to you, my lord, without the presence of your servant. My dearest Mrs. Barnaby, you need not mind Rawlins any more than the coffee pot. You have no idea what a capital fellow he is. True as steel, silent as the grave. That's it, Rawlins. I'll set my foot upon it while you turn the key. Here, it is this crooked one." "Lord Mucklebury, you must be aware," began the widow. "Aware? Good heaven, yes. To be sure I am. But what can I do, my dearest Mrs. Barnaby? I must catch the packet, you see. How is dear, good Miss Morrison? Now for the dressing case, Rawlins. Don't forget the soap. I've done with it. For goodness' sake, don't tell my excellent friend Miss Morrison how very untidy you have found everything about me. She is so very neat, you know. I'm sure she'd... Mind the stoppers, Rawlins. Put a bit of cotton upon each of them. It is thus, Lord Mucklebury, that you receive one who... I know what you would say, my charming friend," interrupted his lordship, handing her a plate of buttered toast, "that I am the greatest bear in existence. No, you will not eat with me. But you must excuse me, dear friend, for I have a long drive before me." And so saying, Lord Mucklebury seated himself at the table, replenished his coffee cup, broke the shell of an egg, and seriously set about eating an excellent breakfast. The widow was at a loss what to do or say next. Had he been rude, or angry, or even silent and sullen, or in any other mood in the world but one of such very easy good humour, she could have managed better. But a painful sort of conviction began to creep over her that Lord Mucklebury's present conduct, as well as all that had passed before, was merely the result of high breeding and fashionable manners, and that lords and ladies always did so to one another. If this were so, rather than betray such rustic ignorance as to appear surprised at it, she would have consented to live without a lover for weeks and weeks to come; and the terrible idea followed, that by having ignorantly hoped for too much, she might have lost a most delightful opportunity of forming an intimate friendship with a peer of the realm, that might have been creditable and useful to her either abroad or at home. Fortunately Lord Mucklebury was really hungry, and he ate so heartily for a minute or two, that the puzzled lady had time to settle her purpose, and take the new tone that her ambition suggested to her, which she did with a readiness that his lordship really admired. "Well, I see how it is, my lord," said she. "I come here to ask you to do a commission for me at Rome, where the papers told me you were going, but you are too busy and too hungry to spare a moment to an old acquaintance." "No, upon my soul," said Lord Mucklebury, throwing some of his former homage into his eyes as he bowed to her. "There is no commission in the world you could give me from New York to Jerusalem that I would not execute with the fidelity of a Western or an Eastern slave. What are your commands, bewitching Mrs. Barnaby?" "Merely, my lord, that you would buy a set of shells for me, as nearly like Lady Stephenson's as possible. And I dare say," she added, very cleverly drawing out her purse, to avoid any misconception respecting the object, "I dare say your lordship, who has travelled so much, may be able to tell me pretty nearly what the price will be. About £10, I think." And 10 golden sovereigns were immediately thrown from the purse upon the table. Lord Mucklebury, perfectly delighted by this brilliant proof of the versatility of her powers, gaily took her purse from her hand, and replacing the money in it, said, "It is not so that I execute the commissions of my fair friends, Mrs. Barnaby. I will note your orders in my pocket book thus: a set of the handsomest shells in Rome for the charming Mrs. Barnaby. See? I can hardly overlook it. And when I have the pleasure of presenting them, we will settle about the price." He replaced her purse in her hand, which he kissed with his best air of Cheltenham gallantry, upon which she wisely rose, and saying, with every appearance of being perfectly satisfied with her reception, "Adieu, my lord. Forgive my intrusion, and let me hope to have the pleasure of seeing you when you return." She took her departure, perfectly convinced that her new-born conjecture was right, and that lords had privileges not accorded to other men. This persuasion, however, as well as the interview which gave rise to it, she determined to keep to her own breast. not sorry, perhaps, that some of her friends might go to their graves with the persuasion that, though deserted by him, she once had a nobleman for her lover, and vastly well satisfied with herself for having found out her plebeian blunder in time to prevent the loss of so very valuable a friend as she still thought Lord Mucklebury might be. She returned in good time to rest and refresh herself with a draught of her favourite beverage, porter, before Mr. Morrison arrived. If she had thought this gentleman worthy of some little agacerie before her definite interview with her noble friend, she certainly did not think him less so afterwards, and the morning and the evening passed away with great appearance of enjoyment to both the gentleman and lady. Mrs. Barnaby began to think, as upon former occasions of the same kind, that it would be vastly more agreeable if Agnes were not of the party. The same idea had occurred to the suffering girl herself more than once in the course of the day. Whether her own wish was father to the thought, or that her aunt had purposely permitted her feelings to be seen, it matters not to inquire. But when, on the following morning, Agnes complained of a headache, and expressed a timid wish to be left at home, Mrs. Barnaby without hesitation replied, " I think you are right, Agnes, you have no strength for that sort of thing ; so it is very lucky you brought your books, and you may unpack them if you will, and set to work." This release was hailed with thankfulness. Lady Stephenson and Miss Peters were both written to during the leisure it afforded, and though she could give no very satisfactory intelligence to either, there was a pleasure in writing to them that no other occupation could give her. After this time several days elapsed, during which Mrs. Barnaby was scarcely at home at all, except for the purpose of eating her dinner, which meal Mr. Morrison regularly partook with them. More than a week passed in this manner. Mrs. Barnaby becoming every day more convinced that, although every sensible woman ought to marry a lord, if she can get one, yet, nevertheless, that an active, intelligent, obliging friend, full of admiration and obedient to command, was an excellent substitute for everything else during an interregnum between the more violent attachments by which the career of all distinguished women must necessarily be marked. And Mr. Morrison, as he on his side remarked how freely the lady hired her flies and her hackney chariots, how little she thought of the price of tickets for plays, operas, and that realization of all her dreams of elegant festivity, Vauxhall, how liberally wine and even brandy flowed at the savoury little dinners in her drawing room, as he remarked on all this, he could not but reason with himself on the greatly superior felicity of being the husband of such a lady, and living without any trouble at all upon her fortune, to the remaining a bachelor in Red Lion Square, under the necessity of working whenever work would be had in order to pay his rent, settle his tailor's bill, and find wherewithal to furnish commons for himself and his one domestic. It is certain, however, that up to this time no serious idea of marrying Mr. Magnus Morrison had entered the widow's head. On the contrary, she was fully determined that, as soon as she had seen London well, she would see Paris too, and was not without a vague notion that there might be something very elegant and desirable in becoming the wife of a French grandee. But these ruminations interfered not at all with the amiable amenity of her demeanour to her assiduous attendant. Agnes was as little in their way as it was possible she could be, the weather was remarkably fine, and on the whole, it may be doubted if any lady of 37 ever made her first debut in the metropolis of the United Kingdoms with more perfect satisfaction to herself. Mrs. Barnaby reached London on a Thursday evening. The first Sunday showed her the Foundling, all the little children, and a popular preacher, which together constituted one of Mr. Morrison's favourite lions. The Sunday following, being the last, according to her own secret determination, that she would pass in England, she was left during the early part of the day to her own devices, Mr. Morrison having a deed to draw which could no longer be safely postponed ; and she therefore obligingly asked Agnes if she should not like to go to church with her. Agnes willingly assented, and they went to the morning service at St. James's. In returning thence, our gaily dressed widow, full of animation, and the hope of finding Mr. Morrison ready to take luncheon with her previous to their projected walk in Kensington Gardens, remarked, as she gracefully paced along the crowded pavement, that one individual among the many who eyed her appeared to follow her movements with particular attention. Mrs. Barnaby was never stared at without feeling delighted by the compliment she thought it implied, and simpered and frolicked with her parasol in her best manner, till at length, having no one else to whom she could point out the flattering circumstance, she said to Agnes, as they turned down Half Moon Street, into which the admiring individual turned too, " Do look at that man, Agnes ! He has never ceased to follow and stare at me since we left the church. There, now he is going to pass us again. Is he not an impudent fellow " Perhaps he knows you, aunt," said Agnes, raising her eyes as the man passed them. " I think I have seen him at Cheltenham." This suggestion heightened Mrs. Barnaby's colour so considerably that it was perceptible through all her rouge. " You have seen him at Cheltenham ? Where, pray ?"" I do not well remember. In a shop, I think." Mrs. Barnaby asked no more questions, but knocked rather hastily at the door of her lodgings ; but though the person had crossed the street, and in doing so passed close to her, he made no attempt to speak to her, but passed on his way, not, however, before he had so refreshed her memory respecting her Cheltenham debts as to make her suddenly decide upon leaving London on the morrow. She found Mr. Magnus Morrison waiting for her, as well looking and as devoted as ever ; so she did all but quite forget her recent alarm, its only effect being, when Agnes, as usual, declined her invitation to go out with them, to say in a whisper to her in the window recess farthest removed from her waiting gentleman, " I think I shall leave London to morrow night, so you may employ yourself in getting everything ready for packing, Agnes." She then turned gaily to her escort, and they set off together. During the whole of this tedious week Agnes had used every means within her very limited power to ascertain what her aunt's plans were for the future ; and this not only to satisfy her own natural curiosity on the subject, but also that she might have sufficient information to justify her writing another letter to Lady Stephenson. But all her inquiries had been so vaguely answered, that she was quite as ignorant of what her next movement might be as when she arrived, and was living in a very torturing sort of suspense, between hope that fate by some means or other would oblige her to return to Cheltenham, and fear lest the mystery that veiled the future might only be elucidated when too late for her to obey the command which, in case of the worst, was to send her there. So weary was she both of her present position and of the doubt which concealed the termination of it, that she joyfully set herself to obey the parting injunction of her aunt ; and having rapidly gone through this task, began her second letter to her Cheltenham friends, stating exactly all she knew, and all she did not know, and at length leaving her letter unfinished, that her postscript, as she said, might contain, according to the imputed custom of all ladies, the essential part of her letter. The fine bonnets and smart waistcoats of Kensington Gardens, together with a bagful of queen cakes, with which she had provided herself for her own refreshment and that of her companion during a promised hour of repose in one of the alcoves, so pleasantly beguiled the hours, that it was near 7 when they returned to dinner ; when the widow confessed herself too tired for anything more that day ; and at an hour much earlier than usual Mr. Morrison took his departure, well informed, as it seemed, of the lady's intentions for the morrow, for Agnes heard him say, " Well then, Mrs. Barnaby, one more delightful excursion to morrow. The Surrey Gardens will delight you. And at 2 o'clock I will be here. Sorry am I to think for the last time, at least for the present." A cordial hand shaking followed, and the door closed after him. " I have done what you bid me, aunt," said Agnes. " All your things are got ready for you to place them as you like, and one of the boxes half filled, just as you did before. Shall I write the directions, aunt? "" We can do that to morrow. I am tired to death. Ring the bell. No, run down yourself, for the girl looks as cross as two sticks. Run down, Agnes, and tell her to get my porter directly, and I think you must bring it to me in bed, for I can't keep my eyes open." " Will you tell me, aunt, where we are going? " said Agnes timidly, as she took up one of the candles to light her steps down 2 flights of stairs. " Don't plague me now, Agnes," was the reply. " I have told you that I am tired to death, and nobody but you would think of teasing one with such a question now. You know well enough, though you have not had the grace to thank me for it, that I never take you anywhere that is not most delightful to go to. What other country girl in the world is there at your age that has the advantages you have? Exeter, Clifton, Cheltenham, London ; and if you don't provoke me too much, and make me turn you out of house and home, I'll take you now ; but it's no matter where, you'll know soon enough to be grateful, if there's such a thing as gratitude in your heart. But I am a fool to expect it, and see you standing there when I've begged, as if my life depended upon it, that you would please to order me a little beer." Agnes said no more, but went to bed that night with her fears most reasonably strengthened that she should not learn Mrs. Barnaby's destination till it was too late to avoid sharing it, let it be in what direction it might. CHAPTER IV.